mice, in a study with mice, they found them like large amounts of sugar for a period of time. They injected a drug into them that blocked the opioid production, and those mice went through the same withdrawal symptoms that you would see somebody withdrawing from heroin or cocaine. So they've also shown that like when given the choice between cocaine and sucrose solution, so sugar solution, rodents consistently prefer the sucrose over the cocaine. And that actually includes rodents that previously were addicted to cocaine. So most of the research articles that are out there, are funded heavily and subsidized heavily by the sugar industry to promote their own interests. And they've employed many of the same tactics and, in fact, some of the same personnel as the cigarette industry employed at the beginning, when they were trying to spread the message that cigarettes weren't addictive, that they weren't harmful.
Today, my special guest is Elanie Welch. She is a nutritionist with her master's in nutrition, and she is a podcaster. Her podcast is called The Renegade Nutritionist, and she is a writer, she is a filmmaker, and she is co-founder of Renegade Nutrition. We had a great conversation today, and I'm excited for you to hear it. Without further ado, here is Elanie Welch. Nutritionist, podcaster, filmmaker, writer, amazing human extraordinaire. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Christina. This is fun. I don't often go on and talk on like other YouTube channels or podcasts. So it's always a treat for me when I get to do that and take a break from my own podcast and help somebody else out on there. So
thank you so much. So first of all, tell me about Renegade Nutrition. It's actually a really interesting name. I actually just Googled before we met, I'm like, what is a renegade? Because it was basically said something like betraying the organization or going against basically the counterculture. And I saw that was right in line with when I looked at your website as well, that basically you have the mission. We chose Renegade Nutrition because to be a renegade means to challenge the status quo. We reject the standard American lifestyle and diet, which is shown to deteriorate health, and provide resources to make a lifestyle of health and thriving, and to make thriving the mainstream. So there's a lot there. Can you just explain a little bit more about how this came about and a little bit more about what is behind this movement?
yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So initially, the reason I started Renegade Nutrition and started the podcast was because I'm a certified nutrition specialist. That's a licensure pathway that required me to get a master's in human nutrition. And I've also gotten 1,000 clinical hours. In the state of Iowa and in many states across the US, that licensure pathway is not recognized. And that's because of some lobbying that has been done by the Dietetics Association. And I'm not condemning dietitians. They're great. They're awesome. Like we could work together. But unfortunately, the umbrella organization really fought to keep certified nutritionists from being able to work in the same space because it would take money from basically the dietitians. And so it's also made it impossible for me to be able to accept insurance and make like nutritional care affordable. And part of not having my licensure pathway recognized by the state, even though I have a master's degree in human nutrition, which is the same requirement for a dietitian. And in fact, up until recently, a dietitian was only required to have a bachelor's. Now the policy has changed and they're required to also have a master's. But so same educational requirement, 1,000 clinical hours, same clinical hour requirement. And I actually, to pass my nutrition boards, went through the same accrediting agency that a dietitian would to pass their boards. So it was all just basically politics, which sucks because it's kept me from being able to practice my profession. Like I cannot legally have my own nutrition practice in Iowa. So the Renegade Nutrition brand came out of, well, fine, if I can't practice my profession in Iowa, I'm going to create a podcast and I can practice my profession that way because at least for now, we still have freedom of speech.
For now.
For now. And so that became my outlet and my platform and my source to be able to share what I know, share what I've learned. Of course, I learned a lot in the course of getting my degree, but I learned just as much, if not more, in all the years that have followed from my own clinical practice with clients. And also through I work under the license of a registered dietitian, so that's how I'm able to practice. But so I learned a lot in my own like consultations with clients, but I've also learned a lot just reading and expanding my knowledge since then. So the renegade part kind of came from the idea of screw your policies. I'm going to share what I know with the world, and I'm going to help people no matter how hard it's become to be able to do that. And also a way to then just provide free information that anybody could get. So, if I can't have insurance cover my services, then I'm not going to charge for the information that I'm sharing. So I can provide them for that information for free to people anyway. So I do see clients still one-on-one through like the Renegade Nutrition business under the umbrella license of the registered dietitian that I work for. But really, my main thing is the podcast. That's how I spread information the most and help people the most. So, yeah, it was a time I was feeling particularly angsty, and I was just like really fed up with it. And I was like, forget it. I don't care what you say. I'm gonna help people, and I'm gonna find a way to do it. And then, it has multiple meanings, of course, but then I'm always challenging what's conventional dietary advice that's out there. There's a lot of conventional advice out there that's very poor, that we're still like in a conventional medical practice, we're still feeding people sort of this misinformation about what diet should look like, what their plate should look like. And so again, it's challenging that status quo of some of the preconceived notions of what is like healthy eating. And so I'm always striving to look for the information that's kind of considered fringe, but that resonates with our audience and we know to be true. So anyway, the renegade has multiple meanings. That's my long.
Yeah, I love that on so many levels. I love that, for example, you didn't allow your voice to be silenced, even though you felt that politically you were being oppressed. But instead of being silenced, you actually took it to a higher level. You're like, fuck that. I'm going to have my own podcast and I'm going to spread my message to the whole world. Yeah, despite having a master's degree in nutrition, if this isn't recognized in the state of Iowa, I'm still gonna motherfucking do my thing, and I'm
That's right.
gonna have a rad podcast, and I'm gonna share my information, and I'm gonna help support people regardless. So I love that, and then I also love what you were saying, that in Renegade Nutrition, you're also trying to dismantle certain standard paradigms about what is maybe the conventional wisdom shared by registered dietitians, and sharing other messages. And so that is another question that I had. Why did you, knowing that in your state that it wasn't necessarily going to be recognized, why did you get your master's in nutrition instead of becoming a registered dietitian? Is it because that there's certain things that you knew were being taught in the program of the RDs that weren't resonating with you, or what inspired you to go in the path of getting your master's in nutrition?
Yeah, well, I knew that I have friends who are registered dietitians, and I knew that a lot of what they're taught has to tie into conventional medicine, which for my friends that were registered dietitians was very frustrating, right? It was information they knew wasn't correct, but they're serving for the most part in a dietitian's role. You go through clinical training in a hospital setting, so a lot of it is reactive. You're working with people after they've had a heart attack or after they've had a cancer diagnosis or after they've been diagnosed with diabetes. And part of me was like, I want to work with people before they reach that stage. I want to work with them before they have that diagnosis, because prevention is ultimately the best way to go. Of course, I help people with those diagnoses as well. So I wanted to be more preventative than reactionary. So that was one reason. And another reason, as I mentioned, was just knowing a lot of what was being taught in dietetic programs, which I learned about from friends who were going through those programs. They felt very frustrated by how conventional it was. It's the food pyramid, which now is like my plate, where it's eating all these servings of grains and then like just not enough emphasis on fats and proteins. And they were being just like held in by the tethers of what is required of their profession. And so holding a license also required them to sort of say and do certain things which they may not believe in. And I also didn't want that. Like I didn't want to be held in by those tethers. So that was the main reason for choosing to go with a nutrition program, even though I knew it would then be harder to practice in my own state. I'd rather face challenges in practicing than be able to practice but not be able to say what I needed to be able to say. And working in a conventional medical office with, like, let's say a medical doctor wasn't something that really appealed to me. I mean, there are medical doctors out there, of course, that have a more holistic mindset, but if you're not in a practice with one of those medical doctors, I think every day of work for you is frustrating. And a lot of the dietitians I know that face those limitations have gone on to form their own practices, and that's how
Mhm.
they do it. Now they're able to share the wisdom they really know, because it's not like dietitians don't know anything. Most of them, like I do, have spent several years unlearning what they've learned and learning material that's actually true. So again, it's not like I don't have anything against dietitians besides the organization that kept me from being able to practice my own profession, but I just knew it would be a frustrating journey where a lot of the information I'd be learning would be more conventional in nature, and I didn't need that to be the foundation of my education. So,
Mhm. Totally understandable. One of the messages that you share in your podcast is about the perils of sugar. And that is a big way to subvert the norm. If we're talking about counterculture and actually something that can be pretty controversial, that can inflame people, is talking about sugar for some reason, even though I'm kind of one of those people that's like, live and let live. Like, I let you eat what you eat. Don't talk about what I eat. Let me eat what I eat. But for some reason, it really gets people riled up. And I think it kind of comes back to how does one live a good life? And so it like somehow gets philosophical.
yeah.
Like, some people think that this is the way that you live a good life and this is what you need to be healthy. That is to say that I accept different perspectives on sugar. If they want to eat sugar in moderation and that is good for them, I'm not going to say no. But my personal experience and perspective and my primary orientation, especially with people who have history of trying that and it not working successfully for them, and who identify especially as a sugar addict or someone who's had issues with ultra processed food addiction in general, the abstinence framework can be really helpful. And so that is where you don't eat any sugar, because even just a little bit of sugar can be considered, toxic, poisonous, or basically just like contributing to cravings. So better to just not have it in the first place, because just a little can spark this cycle. I wonder what your perspective is on just having a little bit and how it can be addicting for the brain. I just want to open the gates for you to just share as much as you can with whoever might be listening or viewing this channel.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that so much of our information research on sugar has been heavily edited by the sugar industry. There's a great book. It's The Case Against Sugar. It's written by Gary Taubes. He was an investigative journalist. I think it's important to know that the sugar industry has worked very, very, very hard to censor research studies showing that sugar is harmful. They themselves have funded most of the studies available on sugar, which of course is a conflict of interest because the sugar industry is not going to share research that shows that sugar is harmful. So most of the research articles that are out there are funded heavily and subsidized heavily by the sugar industry to promote their own interests. And they've employed many of the same tactics and, in fact, some of the same personnel as the cigarette industry employed at the beginning, when they were trying to spread the message that cigarettes weren't addictive, that they weren't harmful. So I think that it's important to know that those are really dirty tactics, and the sugar industry has used them as much as the cigarette industry did. Now, ultimately, the cigarette industry lost that battle, and so my hope is that eventually the sugar industry will as well. But, if you Google, is sugar harmful? One of the first websites that comes up is like sugar, like the truth about sugar or something like that, where it's actually like the sugar industries. Then they're like, this is why sugar is not harmful and it's a natural substance and but it's all bogus. So I think that that's important for anybody to understand. When you're looking at research, look at who funded that research, and you really sometimes have to dig deep because it may not always be apparent. But ultimately, the information that's out there has been pretty censored. So that's just that. Like, that's my soapbox on that. But when we're talking about sugar and addiction and what sugar does to your brain, I think one of the best things to understand is why we're wired to become addicted to sugar, because in understanding that element of things, it helps us know, okay, why am I craving this and what can I do about it? And the more informed you are, the better equipped you are to kind of resist those cravings or alter them or change, your mindset, your perspective on it. So if you think back historically, it was advantageous for us to crave sugar. So if we're going back to like our hunter gatherer ancestors, our brains use sugar for fuel. They use glucose for fuel, and our bodies use glucose for fuel. Half of the energy used in our body actually is used by our brain. And so our brain requires quite a lot of fuel. And sugar is one of those main sources for the brain. So when sugar was scarce, when we were eating primarily, animal products and hunting for our animals and moving around, first of all, we were using way more energy in our daily lives than we do now, right? We were burning a lot more calories. We weren't having these sedentary lifestyles. So we needed sources of fuel, and we needed amongst those sources of fuel quick burning fuels like carbohydrates, like sugar. And that would have been advantageous because if you were out hunting and suddenly you were approached by like a predator species, a saber-toothed tiger or something like that, you needed quick energy to be able to run away. So carbohydrates are very and sugar is a carbohydrate, right? So there's an advantageous evolutionary perspective to craving sugar because your body needed it. It was hard to find. Of course, today sugar is not scarce, but that pattern of craving it still remains in our brains because even if you're thinking from an evolutionary perspective, sweet tasting foods generally in nature are healthy, right? They're fruits and they're vegetables. If you've never quit sugar, you might not realize that vegetables are actually quite sweet in nature. But if you've gone a long period of time without having sugar, you realize how sweet vegetables are. So fruits and vegetables and honey and things that in nature are sweet are generally healthy, right? And toxic foods may usually taste like bitter or rotten or sour, um, which is the absence of sweetness. And those things could have potentially signaled a poisonous food or a rotting food or whatever, right? So it actually was advantageous for us to crave sweet foods in a way because a sweet food was generally safe.
Mhm.
And avoiding bitter foods might keep you from getting like food poisoning. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then additionally,
Overly fermented.
right. Yeah. And then, sweeter foods are naturally higher in calories, which our ancestors would have needed. And it's also probably why like children and adolescents crave sweet foods because they're naturally higher in calories and the caloric needs of an adolescent and a child are higher than those of an adult. So until they hit puberty, they tend to need a higher caloric input. And so they may crave more sweet foods because sweet foods tend to provide those calories in higher numbers. When we consume sugar, our tongues send signals to our brain. There's sweet receptors on our tongues, and then the activation of those receptors sends a signal to our brain. And the brain pathways that those sweet receptors use are important for pleasure, memory, and reward. So that triggering of that sweet pathway triggers the release of dopamine, which is a feel good hormone. It brings you feelings of joy and happiness. And it also enables you to form memories. And you look forward to doing that thing again. So when you trigger dopamine, you experience joy, you form memories, you look forward to doing that thing again, which is why we often associate sweet foods that contain sugar with happy memories because you're actually releasing dopamine and allowing that memory to form in the first place. So I think that's why so often people associate like sweet foods with certain memories, whether it's like Christmas and you're thinking of your grandmother's apple pie, or like it's your mom's like homemade cookies or whatever. It's because you're actually craving the memory. You're craving the warmth and the joy and the happiness that came with that memory, and the thing that allowed you in that instance to form that memory was the release of dopamine, which would have come from that sweet food. Now, of course, there's other things we can do to release dopamine, but I just think that's really important for people to understand. That's the pathway by which that's happening, and it's why like we call them comfort foods because really it's the comfort we're experiencing was like the warmth of that family member's presence, but the thing that's enabling enabling us to relive that memory is the sweet food that triggered it in the first place. So, what we're actually craving is that experience. But dopamine also is an important hormone in our body because it counteracts the effects of stress, and especially stress hormones such as adrenaline. So that's why we also crave sugar when we are stressed. Like you have a really hard day at work or your kids are driving you up the wall, and people tend to reach for sweet foods because dopamine counterbalances the effects of adrenaline. So, again, that's like a survival advantage. Unfortunately, when we're consuming excess sugar and that's becoming like a coping mechanism for us, then we can create some pretty unhealthy brain chemistry because you're creating an imbalance between dopamine and adrenaline.
Mhm.
Um, and that imbalance associated with that excessive sugar consumption is very similar to what drug abuse does to your brain. So, just like alcohol and cocaine and other addictive substances trigger dopamine, so does sugar. And so when you're creating like this flood of dopamine, which is out of balance by consuming sugar incessantly or in
Mhm.
excess, your body wants to maintain balance. Like your body always wants to maintain homeostasis. And so it will try to stem the flow of that dopamine. And so it will try to reduce your endogenous dopamine production. So over time, what happens if we're consistently consuming excess sugar is we're creating too much dopamine. Our body is trying to counterbalance that. And so it's stemming and reducing our endogenous production of dopamine. So over time, your natural endogenous production of dopamine becomes chronically low, which then leads to depression, leads to anxiety. And so now,
Intolerance.
yeah, right. Now you need more sugar in order to get the same amount of dopamine release that you would have gotten from less sugar at the beginning. And this is the same pathway by which any addiction to any hardcore drug, whether it's like a prescription medication,
Mhm.
opioids, or street drugs, it's the same pathway. So that's the pathway by which we're creating addiction because what we're craving is the happiness, the dopamine release, and that's becoming harder and harder to find. It's why you'll meet people, especially people who have like had type 2 diabetes for a long time, and they can just pour like boatloads of sugar into their coffee and like you might be watching me like how can you drink that? It doesn't actually taste that sweet to them anymore, and some of that is
Mhm.
because the sugar receptors have become dulled in their
Mhm.
mouth, and some of it is because they're chasing that dopamine release, which is now being like chronically reduced. That's a problem, right? Because now we're consuming
Absolutely.
more sugar, we're trying to
Mhm. Mhm.
counterbalance that. Um, and then of course we're also triggering this reward system within our brain, which again would have been evolutionarily advantageous because if you found like let's say some berries, which would have been much lower in sugar than the berries we're consuming today, it would have been important to trigger a reward pathway so that you knew, oh, I want this again, because you may not find those berries again outside of a short season of time, right? Like they'd be small, they'd be low in sugar. You could consume as much of them as you wanted to because in a month they may be out of season. We didn't just have fruit available to us year round. We used to have to eat
Mhm.
with the seasons. Now we just ship produce in from other countries where it is in season and we spray it with ethylene and we do things to like ripen it, right? It's that reward pathway, that dopamine triggering pathway, all of those things are tied together that make us kind of chase that feeling, which today in our world of it's actually harder to avoid sugar now than it is to find it. Now that's like a huge problem. A study that was published in the journal Nature, which is a pretty big scientific peer reviewed
Mhm.
like journal. In 2023, they published a study that showed when a person drinks a sucrose solution, so a type of sugar, multiple regions of our brain's neurons become activated, and those same regions activate when somebody consumes cocaine. So it's literally the same activation of your brain as a hardcore street drug.
Mhm.
Um, and sugar actually is in some case studies and animal studies seems to be more addictive than cocaine itself, not only because it produces dopamine, but because it also triggers the production of endogenous opioids in our brain. So we have opioid receptors because our body endogenously produces opioids. Many people don't know that. Like you think of opioids being an external substance
Right.
you take, but your body actually endogenously produces those. And sugar also triggers the release of those opioids, which, as we know now, leads to addiction and dependence. There's a lot of elements that you're up again. And ultimately, once you start going down that pathway of addiction, it's very hard to turn that mechanism off. So if you're wiring your brain in a certain way, then you're going to reorder your brain reward circuitry in the same way that you would if you had like heroin, if you had cocaine. Mice, in a study with mice, they found them like large amounts of sugar for a period of time. They injected a drug into them that blocked the opioid production, and those mice went through the same withdrawal like symptoms that you would see somebody withdrawing from heroin or cocaine. So they had teeth chattering, they had like forepaw tremors, like their limbs were shaking, they had head shakes, they became depressed. So it's the same withdrawal symptoms as somebody withdrawing from cocaine or heroin when they're withdrawing from sugar. They've also shown that, like, when given the choice between cocaine and sucrose solution, so sugar solution, rodents consistently prefer the sucrose over the cocaine. And that actually includes rodents that previously were addicted to cocaine. So even rodents that are addicted to cocaine and are entered into this experiment will still choose sugar over cocaine if they're given an option. So that's pretty intense. Like,
That is so wild. I think thank you so much for sharing all that information. I think it is so, so helpful, partly because it can really, I think, help to reduce the shame for someone who's really struggling with all these symptoms, with these massive urges to binge and go back to the food, even when they know that it's not good for them and they feel like it's destroying their lives or running their lives, and yet they're still finding themselves back in the food. But instead of them being like, God, what the fuck is wrong with me? Instead, if they can be like, wow, this is really a product of evolutionary heritage. These are biological and neurochemical mechanisms that are at play. And it's not that I am flawed, that I have no willpower. This is something physical that is going on, and this is normal, and that this is natural.
well, and even just like, as you said, the word willpower, I think so often, like you said, we just need to remove the shame because your brain is literally wired to create a dependency on sugar. And if you didn't know that, and most people didn't know that, and you've consumed excess sugar, your brain is simply doing what it was designed to do, which would have been evolutionarily advantageous. So your body is very wise and you can trust your body's wisdom, but you have to be able to remove the things that are coming in to interfere with that wisdom. And that includes excess consumption of something that wouldn't have been available at the time that all of that wisdom was being inputted. And when we talk about willpower, willpower is actually a finite resource. So you wake up with a certain amount of willpower, and that amount of willpower decreases throughout the day. It's why we tend to make poorer decisions as the day goes on. So that's even a finite resource. So I think for people to understand that, it's like they feel shame, like, oh, I'm not strong enough. But let's just say you're having a really stressful morning. Like, you're using a certain amount of willpower to even like get out of bed, and you're facing all these hard decisions. And like, do I have these donuts in the break room? Oh, and do I go like to this meeting? And am I going to have this sugary beverage with my lunch? Like, you're constantly making decisions that drain your willpower. So by the end of the day, you don't really have much willpower left, which is why then people might be pursuing like dessert with dinner because they're totally out of the thing that allows them to make conscious healthy decisions. So when we're talking about willpower too, it's important for listeners to understand to set yourself up for success in the best ways possible and remove some of those harder decisions from your house. So we can get into that more. But even just as you're saying willpower, like even that is just a finite resource. Everybody has a finite amount of that. And you will run out of it at some point in your day if you're not setting yourself up for success and reducing the number of decisions you have to make.
I agree with that. I think trying to automatize our decisions as much as possible so that we are we have systems for success and we're not constantly having to choose. So, for example, I personally am a big meal prepper. I like doing batch cooking. I try to make things as easy as possible. Like, those are some of the ways that I try to set myself up for success. I think that the information that you were sharing is also really significant because and not just that it's, oh my gosh, it's all doom and gloom, but just for us to be aware that if we consume these substances and these food like substances, artificial sweeteners, and the ultra processed foods, that we are really setting ourselves up to be in an uphill battle because these are really really compelling substances. So now shifting gears, how can we make better choices in a society that's really encouraging us, and we have big corporate money, with their messages on how sugar is totally fine and we just need to be better. How can we resist these messages and set ourselves up for success?
Great question. And I think one of my philosophies is if your friends don't think you're crazy, then you're not you're not doing enough. You know what I mean?
I
Um,
like you.
right? I get a lot of eye rolls from people at parties and stuff, but it's just that I know what I know, and I can't go back to pretending I don't have this information, you know? I think that it's really important to, like you mentioned, set yourself up for success. And it can be difficult. You are going against the mainstream. You are going against the status quo. It can feel sort of isolating, right? If all of your friends are consuming sugar, or they're going out for drinks, right? Alcohol is another big problem because it depletes our willpower. And so because we know willpower is finite, if you're consuming alcohol, it literally consumes your willpower, which is why you'll make poor like life decisions on alcohol, but you'll also make poor dietary decisions because you run out of the ability to say no.
So I don't drink anymore, girl.
Yeah. I've been 3 years nothing, so I don't drink either for some of those reasons. Also because I get kind of mean when I have alcohol, and I was, like, picking fights with my husband. I didn't like that side of me, so
Right. Oh yeah, I've got stories too.
yeah, so I think it's like all around it's better just to avoid those things. But again, that becomes difficult because your friends want to go out, they want to go to a restaurant. That restaurant may not, like, they may want to go out for fast food, and they may want to go out to the movie theater and buy candy, and like
Mhm.
everything becomes sort of centered around food, and that can be difficult. But I think some of it is understanding what it's doing to your body, right? Cancer fuels or sugar fuels every form of cancer. It fuels dementia. It fuels Alzheimer's. It creates, so like sugar in our bloodstream converts to something called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. And that acronym is very appropriate because they age you. So they cause wrinkles in your skin, and they shorten your telomeres. And so you have a shorter lifespan. And so ultimately, I think that being armed with that knowledge helps you go against the mainstream, because for the short term, it may be hard to turn down that invitation to like a dinner that you know is not going to be healthy for you. But in the long term, isn't it much easier to not have to go through cancer or Alzheimer's or dementia
Mhm.
or heart
Mhm.
disease? And even if you're just like a more shallow person, you're like, well, I just don't want to look old before my time, right? Like all of those things are like constantly that information is sort of running through my mind. So I always am just, I guess the philosophy I live by is the 90-10 rule. So 90% of the time, I'm making decisions that bring me closer to health. And 10% of the time, I give myself grace and freedom and leeway to make whatever decision, whether it's leading me to health or not. Right. And so I think having structures like that in place can be helpful because it keeps it from feeling too restrictive. But it also just like if you want to go out to dinner with your friends or get a drink with your friends, then that becomes part of your 10%. And so maybe that's the only time of the week that you're indulging in those things. And so you start to just create healthy boundaries around it. But it's a challenge, right? Because you're going to get a lot of eye rolls. And ultimately, I'd say one of the most helpful things is to surround yourself with people who are like-minded. So there was a really interesting study that I just was reading that your life decisions are impacted not only by your immediate circle of friends, like your closest, most inward network of friends, but it's also impacted by those friends' friends. And it's also
Mm.
impacted by those friends' friends' friends. So it's actually like 3 layers of separation. So, if somebody in one of those outward circles is, like, let's say, getting into like a new smoking habit or drinking a lot, they influence their inward circles of friends, which influences your inward circles of friends. So if you're spending a lot of time with people who are following and chasing unhealthy habits, it naturally influences your life habits and it becomes much harder to make healthy decisions. It's not saying that you're going to become a smoker, but if you're constantly hanging out with smokers, it becomes much harder to resist
Mhm.
those sorts of habits.
Mhm.
So I think choosing your friends wisely is a big step and a big part of that. So if you're on a health journey and you're wanting to reverse, an addiction, which it really is an addiction, then you need to, just like if you were an alcoholic or addicted to cocaine, just like you would move away from the friends who are addicted to those substances and find people who can help you stay clean. It would be the same thing with your journey in health, which maybe sounds extreme, but that's where we're at. Like
Mhm.
80% of us are going to die from a chronic disease, and 90% of those chronic diseases are preventable through lifestyle habits. And so I think it becomes imperative that we choose our company wisely because it will make making those healthy decisions easier. If you have a friend who eats healthy and goes to the gym and enjoys going on walks and hikes in nature, then those are the sorts of things you're going to be doing when you spend time with that friend. But if you're hanging out with a friend who smokes and drinks and gets into fights and eats tons of processed foods and wants to go out for like McDonald's every weekend, then those are the things you're going to
Right.
be doing when you're with that friend. So it kind of becomes like sort of a difficult decision, but looking at who can I surround myself with that brings me closer to health and life.
That those are some great tips. Absolutely.
And not easy, right? Like simple, but not
No.
easy, right?
Right. I would love to hear about your documentary.
Yeah, so the, like, emphasis and part of why the documentary came into place was because I was observing that the pathway to healing was very multifaceted, and so I was observing in my own nutrition practice that some people would get better very quickly with specific nutritional interventions, and some people would barely move the needle. And that was really fascinating to me. And as I started the podcast, I started to hear from a lot of different audiences. So I started to hear from people who were into like mindful movement and yoga as a restorative healing capacity. And I started learning about the placebo effect and how mindset impacts our healing. And I started learning about how emotional traumas can cause like chronic disease, heart disease, cancer. And so I just began to realize probably a lot of why I would have clients that didn't see success when other clients would was because ultimately there might be a different root cause. So the person who's
Mm.
facing cancer who's not getting better may have an emotional trauma that they haven't addressed. Um, and and so I decided that we needed to show that multifaceted pathway of healing. And so the documentary is called Alive and Well Healing from Within. We're following several families that are healing from chronic and autoimmune diseases. And we're implementing interventions at every level to help them not only with nutrition, so improving their nutrition, improving, their lifestyle, getting them moving, getting them outdoors, getting their circadian rhythms back so they're getting outside and seeing the sunshine, and but
Mhm.
also working with them on emotional healing, dealing with past emotional traumas, working with them on their rest and recovery, improving their heart rate variability, which is a huge metric of our body's ability to
Mhm.
deal with stress. So it's very multifaceted, and we wanted to show that healing is complex because I think holistic healing, functional medicine can get a bad rep because some people have success and some people don't, just like they do in conventional medicine, right? But ultimately, if we're not addressing those main pillars of healing and addressing all of them, then we may not find success. And so we wanted to show when you do address all of those main pillars of healing that you really can heal from pretty much any disease. So that was the impetus for the documentary. And it's probably going to come out 2027. We just started filming in June of this year. And we just started our first crowdfunding campaign at the end of November, beginning of November. So now we're just in the midst of that. We're carrying that on through January and trying to crowdfund the documentary. So we're in the early stages. We've already won an award from from the Heart Productions. They gave us a Hot Film in the Making award, so
Ooh,
that was really
congrats.
exciting. Yeah, and validating because we're early on, but they already really think there's a lot of potential in what we're doing. So it's been an exciting, challenging, rewarding process so far.
That is so impressive. I love that.
Thank you.
Are you working with a team? Like, is there like a functional medicine doctor and a therapist, or like how many people are involved in supporting these families?
Yeah, so we have a subject matter expert for each area. So we have somebody in the functional
Okay.
movement. We have an expert for heart rate variability, rest, and recovery. We have a functional medicine specialist that they're working with
Mhm.
to work on
Mhm.
diet and supplements. And then they're also working with a health coach. And then they're also working with somebody who's certified in dealing with like emotional traumas.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's very multifaceted, but we've built out a whole team of people that helps them on every level, and then we're just doing our best to capture those elements as we can put them in place. So, of course, it's like any healing journey is ups and downs, and hopefully the
Mhm.
documentary captures
Mhm.
that side of things as well. It's not just an upward trajectory. A lot of times you get better, you feel worse, you get better, you feel worse, but you're always hopefully moving towards your health goal. So,
Mhm. And even if you are moving backwards, you're still learning what didn't work.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
That is so exciting. I can't wait to see it. 2027. I'll mark my calendar.
Yes, Alive and Well Healing from Within, and you can find you can go to aliveandwelldocumentary.com, or you can go to our website, which is therenegadenutritionist.com, and you can click on our documentary tab, so it takes you to the same place if you wanna learn more about that film.
Great. And if people want to follow you, learn more about all the things, what are the best ways or the best way to do that?
Our podcast is probably your best bet. I am on Instagram. My handle is at the underscore renegade underscore nutritionist. So you can find me there. I'm terrible about posting. I'm not like a huge fan of social media. It drains me. It's
Yeah.
kind of a necessary evil in the world we live in for promotion. So I'm trying to be better about posting consistently, but it's just really draining for me to be on that
Oh,
platform.
yeah. Me too.
But our podcast, Renegade Nutrition Podcast, is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, most of the main podcast platforms. So you can find the Renegade Nutrition Podcast there. And we do have new weekly episodes. And our top episode right now is Your Brain on Sugar, Why Sugar is Addicting, and How to Beat It. So I go into some of the things we talked about in this episode with you today, but then I also go into alternatives for sugar. Like if you have sugar cravings, I go through a plan of what's the best way to kind of beat that craving, whether you should go cold turkey, because it depends on the person, whether you go cold turkey and just quit sugar and sweet things
Mhm.
altogether, or if you just replace it with healthier substitutes. So I go into how to know when to do each of those things, and then what sugar substitutes I generally recommend. And we have a
Mhm.
lot of episodes on sugar. It seems to be the topic most people want to know about, and for good reason. So, yeah, you can find new weekly episodes there all the time. We're always posting, even through the holidays. We schedule episodes out. So that's
Mhm.
probably your best source of information. Of course, it's all free. So,
That is so great. Thank you so much. It's been such a delight having you here. I thank you so much for sharing your beautiful information and wisdom with me and with anyone who might be listening or viewing. So thank you so much.
yeah, you bet, Christina. And thank you for your listeners for listening in today. And thanks for what you're doing. I think it's so important spreading the word however we can, and helping people make healthier decisions because, gosh, we need it now more than ever. So,
We do.
yeah. So
Thank
thanks for
you.
listening too. Thanks for having me on.